She was rejected everywhere because of her appearance. They slammed doors in her face. They laughed at her in the street. But this woman didn't give up. She walked 5 miles into the wilderness, knocked on the door of a dilapidated farmhouse, and from there, she began to change everything. If you believe that true strength doesn't lie in appearance, hit like and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know where my story has come. And stay until the end, because this story won't let you down. The stagecoach dropped her at the edge of Black Ridge just before noon, and Maeve Dalton had exactly 43 cents, a canvas bag that had seen better decades, and her mother's recipe journal wrapped in oilcloth tucked under her arm like it was the last valuable thing in the world. Because it was. She stood in the middle of the main street and looked at the town. Black Ridge wasn't much to look at. 2 rows of wooden storefronts facing each other across a road that turned to mud whenever it rained, which out here meant half the year. A feed store, a saloon with a broken shutter, a general goods place with flour sacks stacked in the window. The kind of town that looked like it had given up on ambition sometime around 1870 and never reconsidered. Maeve had passed through worse. She'd worked in worse. That wasn't the problem. She smoothed the front of her dress, picked up her bag, and walked toward the first boarding house she saw. A 2-story place with a sign that said Harmon's Rooms above a neatly painted porch. A decent place. She'd stayed in decent places before. The woman who answered the door was thin in the way that some people wear as a point of pride, like they've been disciplining themselves against some unnamed excess their whole lives. She looked at Maeve for about 2 seconds. Not at her face, not at her eyes, just at her, and something closed behind her expression like a door swinging shut. "We're full," the woman said. Maeve looked past her. She could see a keyboard on the wall inside with at least 4 hooks holding keys. "I just need a room for 2 nights," she said. "I can pay." "I said we're full." The door closed. Maeve stood on the porch for a moment. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, a thing her mother had taught her when she was small and the world was already starting to be unkind. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the next place. The next place was a hotel, a real one, with a register on the desk and a young man behind it who looked barely old enough to shave. He watched her cross the lobby with an expression she recognized. Not cruelty, exactly. More like calculation, like he was trying to figure out how to get out of what he was about to have to do without doing it himself. "Looking for a room," she said. He looked down at his register. He didn't open it. "We only accommodate traveling salesmen and their families," he said. "Company policy." "That's so." Maeve looked around the empty lobby. "Busy season." He didn't answer that. She went to the Mercantile next because she needed to eat, and also because she'd heard in the last town that Black Ridge might be looking for a cook at the boarding house on 2nd Street. The man behind the counter, heavy-set, red-faced, wearing an apron stained with things she didn't try to identify, listened to her ask about work with an expression like she'd said something in a foreign language. "Cook?" he repeated. "I've been cooking professionally for 6 years," she said. "Frontier camps, mining operations, private homes. I've got references." She reached into her bag. He waved off the references before she had them out. "We got no positions open," he said. "And even if we did..." He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. That was the thing about Black Ridge. She was starting to understand. Nobody here said the actual words. They'd trained themselves out of that much. They just looked at her body, broad and solid, her arms that were thick with the muscle of 6 years lifting cast iron and hauling split wood, her face that had never been the kind men wrote poems about. And they made their decisions in about 3 seconds, and everything after that was just theater to move her along. By 2 in the afternoon, she had been turned away from 3 boarding houses, 1 hotel, 2 restaurants that were supposedly hiring, and a laundry that had a sign in the window reading "Workers Wanted" in letters big enough to read from across the street. The laundry woman hadn't even let her finish asking. Maeve sat down on a bench outside the post office and opened her bag and ate the last of the biscuits she'd wrapped in a cloth 2 days ago. They were dry and a little stale. She ate them anyway and looked at the street and thought about what she was going to do. A man coming out of the post office looked at her and then looked away fast, like she'd caught him at something. She didn't make a scene. She didn't cry. Or at least she didn't cry where anyone could see, which was a skill she'd had to learn young and practice often enough that it had become almost easy. She just sat there and chewed her stale biscuits and thought. There had been a name back in Pueblo, a rancher she'd heard mentioned in the same breath as the word difficult, which in her experience usually meant a man who'd had enough trouble of his own that he didn't have much energy left over for giving it to other people. Iron Creek Ranch. A widower named Silas Mercer, running cattle on the far side of the valley, 5 miles out, maybe 6. She didn't have a horse. She didn't have money for a livery. She had legs and a decent pair of boots she'd been resoling for 3 years, and a mother's recipe journal and 43 cents and whatever the opposite of nothing was. She finished the last biscuit, brushed the crumbs off her lap, picked up her bag, and started walking. 10. The road out of Black Ridge turned to a track after about a mile, and the track got rougher as the valley broadened out into dry grass and scrub oak and rock outcroppings that cast long shadows in the afternoon light. She walked steadily, not fast. She knew how to walk long distances. You didn't rush. You found a pace your body could hold, and you held it, and you kept your eyes on something ahead of you rather than counting the miles behind. The journal was digging into her ribs under her arm. She shifted it into the bag. Her mother had started that journal when Maeve was 4 years old, writing in a cramped small hand on whatever paper she could get. Proper notebook pages, the backs of receipts, once a whole section written on the insides of brown paper bags she'd torn flat and pressed smooth. Recipes, yes, but also notes, observations. Things like the broth needs time, not heat, and a biscuit made in anger is always tough, and on a page near the back that Maeve had read so many times the paper had softened at the folds, the best meals come from places of wanting. You have to want to feed someone. It's the wanting that they taste. Her mother had died when Maeve was 19. The journal was the only thing she'd taken that still felt like home. She topped a low rise about 3 miles out and saw Iron Creek Ranch below her in the late afternoon light, and her first thought was, "Oh, this is worse than I expected." The main house was a solid structure, 2 stories, proper construction, built by someone who knew what they were doing, but it had the look of a place that had been running on momentum and not much else for a while. A section of fence along the near pasture was down. The kitchen garden was half dead, just a few struggling plants in dry soil with weeds taking over the borders. One of the outbuilding doors was hanging open and rattling in the wind. The yard had the particular kind of disorder that comes not from laziness but from a shortage of hands and hours. A man was working at the fence along the eastern pasture, driving posts into the rocky ground with a heavy mallet. Even from this distance, she could tell he was working with the kind of focused intensity that meant he'd been at it for hours and was going to keep at it until the job was done, regardless of what his back thought about that. She walked down the track toward him. He heard her coming when she was about 30 yards out, or noticed her anyway, and stopped and straightened and turned. He was a big man, taller than average, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had been lived in hard. Somewhere in his mid-40s, she thought. He was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up, and his hat was pushed back on his head, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, which was unusual. She'd gotten good at reading expressions quickly. "You're a long way from the road," he said. "I walked from Black Ridge." She stopped a few feet from him and set down her bag. Her feet were grateful. "You Silas Mercer?" "I am." He didn't volunteer anything else, just waited. "My name is Maeve Dalton. I'm a cook. 6 years professional experience, frontier kitchens, mining camps, private homes. I've worked with supply shortages, bad equipment, and crews of 30 men who hadn't eaten a decent meal in a week. I have references if you want them, though I understand if you'd rather see the work." She paused. "I'm looking for a position, permanent if it's available. I heard you might be needing one." He looked at her for a long moment. Not the way the people in Black Ridge had looked at her. It was more appraising, she thought. The way you'd look at a horse you were trying to figure out. "Who told you that?" he asked. "Fellow in Pueblo. He'd done some buying from your operation. Said you'd lost your cook about 2 months back." 3 months. He pulled off his glove and rubbed his hand across his jaw. "What happened in Black Ridge?" She met his eyes. "What do you think happened in Black Ridge?" He looked at her again, and something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly. More like recognition, like he'd seen something he understood. Kitchen's a disaster, he said. I'll be honest with you about that. Last cook let it go to hell before he left, and nobody's had time to sort it. The men have been eating whatever any of them can manage to throw together, which hasn't been much. He paused. I can offer room and board and a fair wage if you work out, but I'm not taking someone on permanent until I know they can do the job. Fair enough, she said. What kind of trial? 3 days. You feed the crew, you keep the kitchen running. I'll see what you can do with what we've got. Which isn't much. He said that last part with a flatness that told her it was true, and he wasn't apologetic about it. 3 days is fine, she said. I'd like to see the kitchen and the stores before dark so I can plan. He picked up his glove and his mallet. Come on then, peut-être. The kitchen was, in fact, a disaster. Maeve had worked in bad kitchens before. She'd walked into a mining camp cook shack in Colorado that had a hole in the roof and a mouse problem that had crossed the line into a mouse civilization. She'd managed. But this was different. This was a kitchen that had been functional once. She could see that in the bones of it, the good stone hearth, the solid work table, the proper arrangement of the space, and had been slowly dismantled by neglect and misuse. The hearth had months of built-up ash that hadn't been properly cleaned. The work table had grease ground into the grain of the wood. Pots were stacked with no logic, and at least 2 of them had been left with old food dried into them that would require serious work to shift. The larder had provisions. She gave Silas credit for that. He'd kept the place stocked. But they were organized the way things get organized when nobody's organized anything in months, just shoved in wherever they fit. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment while Silas stood behind her, and she could feel him watching her, waiting to see what she'd do. What time does the crew eat in the morning? She asked. 6 o'clock. How many men? 8 right now. Might have 2 more coming up from the south pasture by Thursday. She did the math. I'll need water, a lot of it, hot and cold, and someone to help me get that ash out of the hearth tonight. I can do it myself, but it'll take longer. I'll send someone. What time is supper tonight? Usually around 7, usually meaning whenever someone gets around to it. Tell them 6:30. She set her bag down inside the door. And Mr. Mercer? She turned to look at him. Do you have a mop? Something moved in his expression that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. I'll find one, he said. She worked that night until past midnight. A young hand named Decker, 17, nervous, with the look of someone who'd been given the worst jobs on the ranch long enough that he'd stopped expecting anything else, came to help her clear the ash and haul water. He didn't talk much at first, just worked, watching her sideways when he thought she wasn't looking. She set him to tasks he could manage and worked around him and didn't comment on the watching. People watched. That was fine. They could watch. By 9 o'clock, the hearth was clean and the fire was going properly, and the work table had been scrubbed twice and most of the pots were clean. By 10, she had a stock going. She'd found beef bones in the cold store, more than enough, and she put them on low with what vegetables she could find, the slightly soft onions and the last of the carrots and a few dried herbs from a jar in the larder that still had some life in them. The smell started changing the kitchen around 10:30. That particular shift that happens when a good stock has been going long enough. Something that smells like heat and sustenance, and if you're paying attention, like something worth coming home to. Decker, who had been sweeping near the door, stopped and lifted his head. That smells like something, he said. It's just stock, she told him. Go ahead and take a cup if you want. He looked at her like she'd offered him something more complicated than a cup of broth. Then he got a cup from the shelf and she ladled some out for him and he stood there drinking it, and he didn't say anything, but the expression on his face, which was the expression of someone who had not tasted something made with care in a very long time, said more than enough. She went back to planning breakfast. The crew of Iron Creek Ranch arrived at the cookhouse at 6 o'clock the next morning to the smell of coffee, real coffee, not the burnt watery stuff they'd been making themselves, along with biscuits coming out of the oven, a pot of thick gravy with salt pork, and a pan of fried potatoes with onions that had been softened in the drippings. There were 8 of them, ranging in age from Decker's 17 to a weathered hand named Crow, who had to be 60 if he was a day, and who walked like his knees had opinions about it. They came in with the particular wariness of men who had been disappointed by meals enough times that they'd learned not to expect anything, and they stopped inside the door and looked at what was on the table, and for a moment nobody said anything. "Sit down," Maeve said from the hearth, where she was pulling the last pan of biscuits. "Food's hot. Don't let it get cold." They sat. They ate. And the thing that happened over the next 20 minutes was something Maeve had seen before. She'd always paid attention to it, the way a good meal worked on people. The hunched shoulders came down. The tight faces loosened a little. Men who had come in barely talking started talking. Not about anything important, just the small currency of daily conversation. What needed doing today, whether the east fence was holding, a brief argument about something that had happened 2 days ago that resolved itself without anyone raising their voice. Silas came in midway through and got a plate and sat at the end of the table and ate without comment. She didn't look at him while he was eating. She'd learned not to watch people eat her food. It felt like hovering. But when the men were finishing up and pushing back from the table, Crow, the oldest one, the one with the knee problems, stopped on his way out and looked at her directly for the first time. "Best biscuit I've had in a year," he said. Not elaborately, just a fact he was reporting. "Thank you," she said. Just a fact she was acknowledging. He nodded and went out. The 3 days were not easy. She was working in a kitchen that was still being sorted, with supplies that were incomplete, for men whose tastes she was still figuring out, while also managing the physical work of frontier cooking, which was not the same as any other kind of cooking. Everything harder. The fire always needed managing. The water was never just there, it had to be hauled. The cold store wasn't cold enough in the afternoons, and you had to work around that, planning what would spoil and what wouldn't, and building the meals accordingly. On the second morning, she made a corn porridge with dried apple that didn't come out the way she wanted. The apples had less flavor than she'd hoped, and she gave it to the men without apology, but made a note to herself about the dried fruit stores and what she'd need to order differently. Decker noticed she'd made a face at it when she tasted it before serving. "Seems fine to me," he told her. "It's fine," she agreed. "I wanted it better." He thought about that. What's the difference between fine and better? She thought about how to answer that in a way he'd actually understand, not just a professional explanation. Fine means they ate it. Better means they remembered it. He chewed on that for a while without responding, but she saw him watching more carefully after that, paying attention to what she was doing and why. On the second evening, she overheard 2 of the hands talking outside the cookhouse. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She was just getting water from the barrel near the door. But the voices carried. "Hale's going to have something to say about this," one of them said. She didn't recognize the voice. "Hale can say what he wants," the other one said. "It's not his ranch." "Might as well be, way things have been going. He gets the bank on his side. Mercer's going to have trouble keeping the place." A pause. "What's he care about the cook?" "He cares about anything Mercer does that goes against how he thinks things ought to be." Another pause. "Victor Hale's the kind of man who can't stand watching someone make a decision he doesn't approve of, and he's got ways of making his disapproval loud." She went back inside and got on with the evening meal. Chick-fil-A? On the morning of the third day, Silas came into the kitchen while she was getting things started for breakfast. It was early, before 5, and the sky outside was still dark, and she'd lit the lamps and had the fire going and was working through the prep in the particular focused quiet she'd developed over years of early mornings. He sat down on the stool near the door, which was where Decker usually sat, and poured himself a cup of the early coffee from the small pot she kept going while she worked. He didn't say anything right away. She worked. She was making a proper bread today. She'd been sour starting it yesterday and it was ready, along with eggs and bacon from the last of the slab she'd found in the cold store. And she was going to do a dried bean soup for the midday meal that would have the bone broth from last night as its base. "The men are different," he said finally. She looked up. "Different how?" "Easier." He turned the cup in his hands. "Not fighting each other over small things. Showing up on time. Crow hasn't complained about his knees once in 2 days, and that man complains about his knees the way other men talk about the weather." He paused. "I'm not saying it's the food. I'm saying something's different." "It's partly the food," she said. "People get small and difficult when they're not eating well. It's not complicated." She went back to the bread. "Though it's also just someone's been paying attention to them. That matters too." Silence for a moment. What happened in Blackridge? He asked. He wasn't asking the same question he'd asked 3 days ago. He was asking the actual question this time. She thought about whether to answer the way she usually answered that kind of question, which was to deflect or give the minimum required, or whether to just say it plainly. She said it plainly. What always happens? They took one look at me and decided what I was worth before I opened my mouth. Couldn't rent a room, couldn't get hired. Laundry Place had a sign in the window that said they were looking for workers, and the woman told me to get off her property before I'd gotten 2 words out. She folded the bread. I've been dealing with that my whole working life. It gets tiring, but it doesn't get surprising. He was quiet for a long time. I heard about Victor Hale, he said. He's been talking. Town council. Says I'm making a mistake that reflects poorly on the community. I heard something about Hale, she said carefully. He'll push. He's got the bank, he's got the council, he's got the social pressure that passes for authority out here. He'll find ways to make this difficult. He looked at her. I want you to know that before you make a decision. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him properly. Mr. Mercer, I walked 5 miles in the afternoon heat because I'd been turned away from every place in that town. I cleaned this kitchen until midnight on my first night. I've been up before 5 every morning for 3 days, and I'll be up before 5 tomorrow and the day after. She held his gaze. What makes you think I'm the kind of person who gets deterred by difficult? Something happened in his face then. That same movement she'd caught before, the one that might have been something warmer than his usual flat expression. He looked down at his coffee. I'd like to offer you the position, he said. Permanent, fair wage, room and board, and if we can sort out the kitchen garden, a portion of what it yields. That sounds fair, she said. Then it's settled. She went back to her bread. He sat there a while longer, drinking his coffee, and the kitchen filled slowly with the smell of something good being made, and outside the window the sky was starting to go from black to the particular deep blue that comes just before light, and in the yard she could hear the first sounds of the ranch coming awake. Boots on the ground, a horse somewhere, a door. She shaped the loaves and set them to proof and started on the eggs. She'd been moving her whole life. Every time she'd landed somewhere, eventually the welcome wore thin or never existed in the first place, and she'd had to move again. She'd gotten good at packing fast and leaving clean. She'd gotten so good at it that she'd started to think that was just what her life was. A series of temporary stays in other people's spaces, never quite belonging, never quite staying. But something about the weight of that kitchen, the way the early light was starting to come through the window, the sound of the ranch outside, something about it sat differently than the places before. She wasn't building anything on that feeling. She'd been wrong before about places feeling different, but she noticed it, and she held it carefully, the way you'd hold something fragile when you weren't sure yet if it would last. Down the hall, she could hear Decker's footsteps, the uneven rhythm of a kid who hadn't quite grown into his legs yet, heading toward the pump to start the morning haul. She cracked the first eggs into the pan. Outside, Blackridge was waking up too. 5 miles away, behind its wooden storefronts and its closed doors and its small, hard certainties about who belonged where. Victor Hale was probably already awake, she thought. Men like that usually were. Early risers. Made them feel righteous. She'd worry about Victor Hale when Victor Hale gave her reason to. Right now she had eggs to get right and 8 hungry men coming in at 6 o'clock, and the bread was proofing and the fire was exactly where she needed it. And for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The talk started before the end of her first full week. Maeve heard it the way you hear most things in a small territory, sideways, in pieces, through the mouths of people who weren't the original source. Decker came back from a supply run into Blackridge on a Wednesday afternoon and found her in the kitchen garden, which she'd been working on in the evenings after the dinner cleanup, pulling weeds by hand in the last of the light. He stood at the gate for a moment before he said anything, and the pause itself told her something. Just say it, she said, without looking up. He came in and crouched down beside the nearest bed and picked up a weed she'd pulled and turned it in his hands like it might tell him something. People are talking about you in town, he said. At the general store. I was there getting the flour order and 2 women were talking near the back, and they stopped when I came in, but I'd already heard enough. What kind of talking? The kind where they've already decided what they think, and they're just passing it around so everyone else can agree. He dropped the weed. Saying Silas has lost his sense, saying it's not right, what he's done. Saying a woman like you. He stopped. A woman like me, she said. Yeah. She sat back on her heels and looked at the row of surviving carrots, which were thin but alive. Decker, I've been a woman like me my whole life. People have been talking about it my whole life. It doesn't change the carrots. He almost smiled. Not quite. He was still worried, she could see that. Young enough that he thought worry might prevent the thing you were worried about. There's more, he said. I heard the Hale name. More than once. She went back to weeding. I figured there would be. What she hadn't fully figured yet was how fast Victor Hale could move when he wanted to. She learned that within the week. The first sign was the flour. The regular supplier out of Granton, a man named Purcell who'd been delivering to Iron Creek for 3 years, sent a message by way of a passing rider that he was ending the account. No explanation, just a terse note that said he was restructuring his delivery routes and wouldn't be able to service the ranch going forward. Silas read the note at the breakfast table without visible emotion and set it down next to his coffee. Purcell's been delivering here since I bought this place, he said. Crow across the table didn't look surprised. Hale's got money in Purcell's operation, he said. Has had for 2 years, everyone knows that. Maeve was at the hearth, but she was listening. She didn't turn around. How much of our supply comes through Purcell? She asked. Flour, salt, dried goods mostly. Maybe a third of what we need through the month. Silas picked up his coffee. There are other suppliers. Not close ones, Crow said. Not that'll deliver out this far without a relationship already built. He paused. Hale knows that. Silas was quiet for a moment. I'll sort the supply, he said. Maeve, if you can give me a list of what you need prioritized, I'll start making arrangements. I'll have it to you by noon, she said. She made the list and gave it to him and went back to work. And she didn't let herself think too much about what it meant that within 1 week of her arriving at Iron Creek Ranch, a man in town had already started pulling strings to make her position untenable. She'd think about it if she needed to. Right now, she needed to figure out how to stretch the existing flour stores farther than they were designed to go, and whether the grain they kept for the horses could supplement the bread if things got tight, and what she could pull from the kitchen garden to reduce the dependency on outside goods. She was good at problems like that. She'd been solving problems like that her whole working life. The second sign came on a Friday, and it was harder to manage than the flour. 2 of the hands quit. They came to Silas together, which meant they'd talked it over beforehand, which meant it hadn't been impulsive. Their names were Garrett and Phelps, both mid-30s, both competent workers. Maeve didn't hear the conversation. It happened in the yard while she was inside. But she heard enough through the window to understand the shape of it. There'd been pressure. Someone had offered Garrett work at another operation at better wages, and Phelps wasn't going to stay without Garrett. She heard Silas say, I'm not going to hold a man who's got a better offer. She heard Garrett say something she couldn't make out, low and uncomfortable. Then Silas said, Say what you mean, Garrett. A pause. It's not just the money, Garrett said. People are talking about the ranch, about... He stopped. I've got family in Blackridge, Silas. My wife's people. They're getting it from both sides and she's... Another stop. I'm sorry. I am. But I can't keep them in the middle of someone else's fight. There was a silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. She heard boots on the ground, moving away. That night, after supper, the remaining crew was quieter than usual. Not the quiet of men who'd made peace with something, the quiet of men who were thinking about whether they'd made the right choice staying. Maeve served the meal and cleared and cleaned and didn't say anything about what had happened because there was nothing useful to say. But before she banked the fire for the night, she made an extra pot of coffee and left it on the back of the hearth where it would stay warm. And she put out the last of the dried apple cake she'd made that afternoon, and she left a lamp burning low. Sometimes you could say things with food that you couldn't say with words without it sounding like a speech. Decker was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway and looked at the lamp and the coffee and the cake, and she could see him working something out. You scared? He asked. She thought about it. Not of Hale, she said. Not exactly. More tired. I've spent a lot of my life around men like him. Men who can't stand that the world didn't arrange itself the way they expected. She straightened the cloth on the work table. They always make it loud before they give up. What if he doesn't give up? Then we deal with that too. She looked at him. Go to bed, Decker. There's fence work at 6. He went. She turned down the lamp and stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, listening to the ranch settle into night. 9 days after she arrived at Iron Creek, everything changed in the space of about 40 minutes, and not because of Victor Hale. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning. Silas and 3 of the remaining hands were out on the South Range. Decker was supposed to be repairing a section of the near fence, which put him about 200 yards from the house. Maeve was in the kitchen working on the midday meal, a proper stew with the bone broth base she'd been maintaining and what potatoes and root vegetables she could pull from the garden. She heard it before she understood what it was, a sound that wasn't a sound she expected, not fence work, not hoofbeats. Something wrong in the rhythm of it, a thud, and then nothing. She went to the window. She couldn't see Decker. She should have been able to see him from the kitchen window if he was at the near fence. She went outside. He was on the ground near the fence post, and the first thing she saw was that he'd fallen sideways, and the second thing was the position of his leg, which was wrong in a way that told her before she got close that it wasn't just a fall. She ran. He was conscious when she got to him, but barely, and his color was bad. Gray-white, with a sheen of sweat across his face that wasn't from the heat. He'd been driving fence posts. Something had gone wrong with the mallet, or the post. She could figure out the mechanics later. And the post had kicked back and taken him across the left leg above the knee, and from the angle and the swelling already starting, she was fairly certain the bone was broken. Don't try to move, she said. And she was already kneeling beside him, her hands moving over his leg with the careful pressure her mother had taught her, reading the injury. Stay still. Talk to me. What's your name? You know my name, he said, which came out slurred. I know your name. Tell me anyway. Decker. A pause, and then a sharp intake of breath when she touched the point of fracture. Decker Hayes. Good. You're going to be fine. This leg is broken. I think it's a clean break, not compound, which is better than the other option. You're going to stay still and you're not going to try to get up until I tell you. Do you understand me? He tried to nod and flinched instead. Good, she said, already calculating. Silas was on the South Range, which was the better part of an hour's ride away without knowing they were needed. Crow was the only other hand on the property, and he was at the barn with a lame horse. She needed splinting materials, cold water, cloth for binding, something for the pain. I'm going to the house and I'll be back in 2 minutes. 2 minutes. You don't move. Where would I go? He said, and even in the shape he was in, it came out almost dry. She ran. The materials she needed were not ideally organized, but she'd spent the last week and a half learning where everything on this ranch was, and she knew where to find straight wood for splinting and where Silas kept the medical kit, which was an old cavalry kit, practical and spare. She gathered what she needed in under 3 minutes and went back. What followed was not a quick or clean process. Splinting a broken leg in a field with no medical training beyond what her mother had passed down, a mother who had herself learned from necessity, from living in places where you were a day's ride from any doctor, was not the kind of work anyone should have to do, and Maeve didn't pretend otherwise. Decker made sounds she tried not to think about too hard, and at one point he grabbed her arm with a grip that was going to leave a bruise and said through his teeth, "Tell me something. Anything. Talk." So she talked. She talked about her mother, about the journal, about a kitchen fire she'd managed in a mining camp in 1878 that had gotten completely out of her control for about 4 minutes, and she still wasn't over it. She talked, and her hands kept working, kept steady, because her hands had learned a long time ago to operate separately from whatever her emotions were doing. She bound the splint and she got him stabilized, and she sent Crow on the fastest horse to the South Range to get Silas. And then she sat on the ground next to Decker and kept talking because that was what he needed, and she had words available, and they were free. By the time Silas arrived at a hard gallop with the other 2 hands behind him, Decker was stabilized, had water in him, and was conscious and coherent, which was better than he'd been 20 minutes earlier. Silas got off the horse before it fully stopped and came to them at something between a walk and a run, and he looked at Decker, and then at Maeve, and then at the splint, and she could see him assessing all of it in about 3 seconds. "He needs a doctor," she said. "The break feels clean, but I can't be certain, and he needs it set properly. Can you get him to Blackridge? I'll take him myself. He crouched beside Decker. How bad? Hurts, Decker said. Miss Dalton talked me through most of it. Silas looked at her again, the same look he'd given her when she'd said, What do you think happened in Blackridge? Something trying to figure out what it was seeing. You know how to do this? He asked. My mother taught me. She didn't have formal medical training either. She just learned what you learn when you're living somewhere that the nearest help is 40 miles away. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her skirt. Get him into town. I'll keep supper going. Maeve. She paused. Thank you, he said. Simple. Not dressed up. He's a good kid, she said. Don't let him put weight on that leg. Tuss. The story got out before Decker was even back from Blackridge with his leg properly set and bandaged. That was the thing about small territories. News traveled faster than horses, or felt like it. By Thursday, 3 different ranches in the valley had heard that the woman at Iron Creek had saved the boy's leg, possibly more than his leg. The doctor in Blackridge, a pragmatic man named Elling, who'd been practicing frontier medicine for 15 years, told Silas privately that the splinting had been done well, that if Decker had tried to walk on it, or if the bone had shifted, the outcome could have been considerably worse. Silas didn't tell Maeve that right away. He told her later, 2 evenings after, when they were both on the porch after supper and the valley was going gold and quiet in the last of the daylight. He said it simply, the way he said most things, without a lot of adornment. She listened and then said, Your mother teach you that? Or you're just naturally sparse with words? He looked sideways at her, and this time the movement in his expression was clearly the beginning of a smile, even if it didn't fully arrive. Little of both, he said. It was the first time anything between them had felt like ease rather than negotiation. But ease was a thing that had to be rationed carefully out here, because Thursday also brought 2 more hands telling Silas they'd heard from their families in town and they were getting pressure, and the situation was making things complicated. One of them, a man named Forsyth, who'd been at the ranch 2 years, said it straight. I'm not saying she should go. I'm saying Hale's making noise and people are listening, and I don't know how long before it affects the cattle business. The buyers know him. He's got relationships. Silas listened to all of it without changing expression. Then he said, Iron Creek Ranch makes its own hiring decisions. That hasn't changed. You want to stay? I want you here. But I'm not dismissing someone who's doing good work because Victor Hale is uncomfortable with my choices. Forsyth nodded slowly. He stayed. But the weight of it was building in ways Maeve could feel even when nobody said anything directly. The supply situation was still unresolved. They'd found a secondary supplier out of Ridgewood, but the cost was higher and the delivery schedule unreliable. 2 buyers who'd been regular customers for Iron Creek beef had sent politely worded letters about reconsidering their accounts, and the rumors moving through the county had shifted in the last week from vague disapproval to something more specific and uglier. Stories about Maeve that she didn't recognize as herself. Stories about her past and her character that were detailed enough to sound credible and false enough that they could only have been invented deliberately. She heard one of them secondhand from Crow, who told her with the bluntness of an old man who'd decided life was too short for managing other people's comfort. They're saying you were run out of your last position, he said, sitting on the fence of the kitchen garden while she worked. That you stole from your employer. Woman named someone specific, a rancher in Colorado, said you took money and goods when you left. She kept pulling weeds. Her hands were steady. There was a rancher in Colorado, she said. His name was Beaumont. I left because his wife started a rumor that I was being inappropriate with her husband, which wasn't true, and rather than fight it, I moved on. That's the whole story. A pause. There are no witnesses to what I'm telling you, and no witnesses to what they're saying. So the only thing you can do is decide which seems more likely to you. Crow was quiet for a moment. I've been watching you work for 10 days, he said. I'm not worried about what seems likely. That meant something to her, more than she showed him. But knowing that the people immediately around her trusted her, and knowing that the people in town were systematically building a case against her were 2 different problems. And the second one was not going to be solved by being good at her job. That was the maddening geometry of it. She could cook the best meals in the territory. She could save Decker's leg. She could work harder and more honestly than anyone they'd put up against her. And Victor Hale could keep manufacturing stories and applying pressure, and it wouldn't matter, because the truth and the story were operating in entirely different arenas. She understood that. She had always understood that. It didn't make it less infuriating. One evening, toward the end of the second week, she was sitting with the journal, her mother's journal, the oilcloth-wrapped one she usually kept put away but sometimes took out when she needed to think, not reading it exactly, just holding it open to a page in the middle. A recipe for lamb stew her mother had made in the winters when they could get the meat. There was a note at the bottom of the page in the cramped, small hand. The stew always came out better when I made enough for extra. A full pot is easier than a half pot. It's not about the math, it's about the intention. She wasn't sure why that hit her the way it did, sitting in the lamplight in her small room off the kitchen, but something about it rearranged itself in her thinking. She'd been treating this situation like a defense, like her job was to hold position, prove herself to the people immediately around her, and weather what was coming from outside. That had been the right instinct for the first 2 weeks. But it wasn't the whole answer. A full pot, the intention. She thought about the county cooking competition she'd heard mentioned twice, once from Decker and once from Crow. Annual event. Held in Blackridge, in the town square, public, the kind of thing where everyone in the county showed up because it was one of the few real social events of the year. 2 months out, roughly. She thought about walking into that, not because she'd win, not because winning would fix anything, but because there was a difference between being a woman who stayed 5 miles outside of town and endured what was said about her, and being a woman who walked into the middle of the thing and made them look at her directly. She'd spent her whole life being told to make herself smaller, to take up less space, to be grateful for whatever room she was given at the edge of things. She closed the journal and looked at the wall of the small room that was hers, in the house that had started to feel like something more than temporary. Running was the thing she knew how to do. She'd done it her whole life. She was good at it. But she was 43 cents and 5 miles of walking into her last chance at staying somewhere, and for the first time in a very long time, the idea of running felt worse than the idea of whatever came next if she held still. She put the journal away and went to bed. In the morning, she got up at 4:30, built the fire, made the coffee, and started on the biscuits. And when Silas came in at 5:15, he'd started coming in earlier, she'd noticed. She didn't say anything about it. She poured him a cup and told him she wasn't going anywhere. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "I didn't ask," he said. "I know you didn't." She went back to the biscuits. "I'm telling you anyway." He drank his coffee. Outside, the sky was doing the thing it did before light, that deep, specific blue, and the ranch was starting to make its waking sounds. And Decker was going to be on a crutch for 6 more weeks, and they were 2 hands short, and the flower situation was only partly resolved, and Victor Hale had not said his last word on any of this. None of that had changed. She hadn't fixed it by deciding to stay. But she'd fixed something, and she could feel it sitting differently in her chest, like a stone that had been in the wrong position and had finally shifted to where it belonged. Crow came in for coffee, then Forsyth, then the others, one by one, the way they came every morning, and the kitchen filled with the sounds and smells of a working day starting. And Maeve moved through it all with the particular efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything was and exactly what needed to happen next. And the biscuits came out right, and the coffee was strong, and outside the window the sky was turning from blue to the first pale wash of morning. She had work to do. She was going to do it. The county cooking competition had been running for 11 years, and in all 11 of those years, the winner had come from one of 4 families: the Aldermans, the Prices, the Whitfields, or some variation thereof, women who had the right kitchens and the right connections, and who spent the 3 months before the event treating the preparation like a military campaign. Maeve knew none of this when she decided to enter. She found out gradually, the way you find out most things at Iron Creek, sideways, in pieces, through conversations that weren't quite meant for her. Crow told her about the Alderman family over breakfast one morning, about 2 weeks after she'd told Silas she wasn't leaving. "Eleanor Alderman has won it 4 of the last 6 years," he said, with the tone of a man reciting facts rather than offering an opinion. "Her husband owns the mill. Her sister married into the Whitfield operation. Between the 2 families, they know every judge on the county panel." "How many judges?" she asked. 5. 3 from Blackridge, 1 from Granton, 1 from out near Ridgewood. She refilled his coffee. "So 3 of the 5 are from the same town where Victor Hale runs the council." Crow looked at her. "You're not backing down from this." I already entered, she said. Silas helped me file the registration last week. He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup. Well, he said finally, that's one way to do it. Silas hadn't tried to talk her out of it, which was one of the things she was starting to understand about him. He didn't manage people's decisions. He'd listened when she told him what she was thinking, and he'd said, "You know what you're walking into?" And she'd said yes, and he'd said, "Then let's file the paperwork." And that had been the end of the conversation about weather. The conversations after that were about logistics, about what she'd need, about whether the kitchen garden could supply what she was planning. The planning itself was where she'd spent most of the following 4 weeks, in the margins of time around the regular work. She had an idea for her competition dish, a frontier pot roast with a reduced bone broth sauce and root vegetables and a cornbread that she'd been quietly perfecting for a month, based on a technique in the journal that her mother had developed for feeding large groups with limited resources and maximum flavor. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't the kind of dish that made people say how refined or how delicate. It was the kind of dish that made people stop talking and just eat, which in Maeve's view was the higher compliment. She practiced it twice on the crew, adjusting the timing and the salt levels and the char on the cornbread. Both times the plates came back clean, and Decker, who was still on his crutch and had therefore been spending more time in the kitchen than usual, told her the second version was better than the first, and then got specific about why, which surprised her enough that she asked him where that came from. "My grandmother cooked," he said, a little defensive. "I paid attention." "You should keep paying attention," she said. "You've got a good palate." He looked like she'd handed him something he didn't know what to do with. Everything was in order. And then, 10 days before the competition, someone got into the cold store. Missed. She discovered it on a Monday morning before 5, when she went to pull the roast she'd been aging for the practice run and found the cold store door not quite latched, which was wrong because she always latched it. And inside the roast was gone, and the bone broth she'd been building for 2 weeks was contaminated. Someone had put something in it. She couldn't immediately tell what, but the smell was off in a way that made her stomach drop. She stood in the cold store for a moment, looking at the shelf where the broth had been, and then she went back to the kitchen and sat down at the work table and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed. Silas found her there when he came in at 5:15. He saw her face and stopped. "What happened?" She told him. He went to the cold store and looked and came back, and his jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen on him before. "I'll find out who came onto the property," he said. "You won't," she said. They were careful. They knew what they were doing. She looked at her hands on the table. "It doesn't matter who. It's Hale's direction regardless of who carried it out. It matters to me." The flatness in his voice had something underneath it now, something with heat. "I know." She looked up at him. "But the competition is in 10 days and I've lost my centerpiece and 2 weeks of broth work, and I need to figure out what I'm doing instead. That's the actual problem right now." He stood there a moment, looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he pulled out the stool and sat down across from her. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Time to think," she said, "and then whatever supplies you can source from the Ridgewood order." "You've got both," he said. She thought for the better part of that morning. She went through the journal, really went through it, the way she didn't always have time for, reading her mother's notes not just for recipes but for the logic underneath them. Her mother had cooked under harder conditions than a missing roast. She'd fed people when there was almost nothing to feed them with, and still managed to make something that mattered. The best meals come from places of wanting. You have to want to feed someone. She'd been building towards something elaborate because elaborate seemed like the right answer to the kind of competition where Eleanor Alderman showed up with techniques she'd learned from a French cookbook. She'd been thinking about it wrong. She'd been trying to speak their language instead of her own. By noon, she had a new plan, and it was simpler and scarier than the original. She was going to make her mother's frontier lamb stew. The recipe on the page with the note about the full pot and the intention. Simple ingredients. Nothing that required special sourcing or 3 days of prep. The kind of food that had fed working people through hard winters in places where there was no mill owner's wife with a French cookbook. The kind of food that didn't try to be something it wasn't. Decker, who was sitting near the window with his crutch propped against the wall, said, "Stew? For the competition?" "Yes," she said, against Eleanor Alderman. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. He didn't say, "Are you sure?" Or do you think that's wise, which was why she was starting to like him as much as she did? The competition was held in the Blackridge Town Square on the last Saturday of September, and it was, as Crow had described it, the kind of event where everyone came out because there wasn't much else that counted as entertainment in the territory. By the time Maeve arrived with Silas and Crow and Decker, who had absolutely refused to stay behind, crutch and all, the square was already full. Tables set up in rows, cooking stations with equipment, a raised platform at the north end where the judges would sit, and between the stations and the platform, somewhere in the range of 200 people milling around and talking. She felt them notice her arrive. That was not her imagination. There was a shift in the ambient noise of the crowd, a small recalibration, as people registered who had just walked in. She kept her face forward and her pace even and found her assigned station and set down her things. The station next to hers belonged to Eleanor Alderman, who was already there and already organized, and who looked at Maeve with the particular expression of someone who has seen something unexpected and is trying to decide whether to acknowledge it or not. Eleanor was in her late 40s, handsome in a composed way, wearing a better dress than the occasion probably required. She had 2 assistants with her, which Maeve noted without comment. "I didn't know you'd entered," Eleanor said. "There it is," Maeve said pleasantly, and started unpacking her supplies. Eleanor said nothing else. She turned back to her own station and spoke quietly to one of her assistants, and Maeve didn't try to hear what she said. The sabotage, the second round of it, more direct, started about 40 minutes into the cooking time. She'd noticed the boy early, 16 or so, hanging near the back of the crowd with the studied casualness of someone who was supposed to look like he wasn't paying attention. She'd noticed him because, in her experience, people who were trying not to be noticed usually were, by her at least. She'd been reading rooms her whole life. It was a survival skill. When she turned to reach for her herb bundle, the dried thyme and sage she'd wrapped and brought from the kitchen garden, it wasn't where she'd set it. She looked. She checked the other side of her station. She looked on the ground. It was gone. She straightened up and scanned the crowd and caught, for just a second, the edge of the boy slipping into the press of people. And she made the calculation instantly. She could pursue it and lose her cooking time and make a scene, or she could solve the problem. She turned to the woman at the station on her other side, a plain-faced woman in her 30s she didn't know, who'd been watching the whole thing with an expression of flat disapproval directed at the boy's retreating back. "Excuse me," Maeve said. "Do you have dried thyme you could spare? A small amount." The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she reached into her own supplies and pulled out a cloth bundle and held it out. "Take what you need," she said. "I saw what happened." "Thank you," Maeve said. "Don't thank me. Just cook something worth the trouble." She turned back to her station and went back to work. The stew was already going. She'd started the broth as soon as she got her fire established, because you couldn't rush broth. And the lamb was going in next, cut into pieces and browned first in the fat from the pan, the way her mother had always done it. The browning was not optional. That was where the flavor started, in the color of the meat, in the fond that built up on the bottom of the pan that would dissolve into the broth and change it from good to something else entirely. She worked through the rest of the cooking time with the particular focused calm she'd developed over years of difficult kitchens. Around her, she was aware of the crowd and the noise and the other competitors, and she registered all of it in the peripheral way you register things when the main part of your attention is somewhere else. Eleanor Alderman was making something that smelled aggressively of expensive spices. 2 stations over, someone was attempting a pastry that was giving them trouble. She could hear the frustration in the silences. Her station smelled like winter, like something your body recognized before your mind did. Decker had found a spot at the edge of the competitor area, leaning on his crutch, and he watched her work with the same focused attention he'd been bringing to everything in the kitchen for the last several weeks. Crow had disappeared into the crowd. Silas stood near the back of the square, and she could see him occasionally in the press of people, taller than most, watching. At one point, a man she didn't recognize stopped near her station and looked at what she was making and said, loud enough for the people around him to hear, "That's just stew." He said it the way you'd say, "That's just a dirt road," or "That's just a barn," the kind of comment designed to establish a hierarchy. She didn't look up from the pan. "Yes," she said. "It is." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and moved on. When the cooking time ended and the judges came to each station to sample and score, Maeve lifted the lid on her pot, and the steam came up and filled the immediate space with the smell of it. Lamb and broth and root vegetables and herbs. The kind of smell that didn't announce itself politely, but just arrived. The way cold weather arrived or morning arrived. Completely, and without asking permission. The first judge, a Blackridge man she recognized from Crow's descriptions as an alderman family connection, took a spoonful and his expression didn't change much. But he took a second spoonful, which told her something. The second judge, a woman from Granton, took one bite and then set down her fork and looked at the pot like she was trying to figure out what she was dealing with. The third judge, the one from Ridgewood, was the one who said something out loud. "What is this?" he asked. Not critically, just honestly, the way you'd ask about something that surprised you. "Frontier lamb stew," she said, "based on a recipe from my mother." He nodded slowly and took another bite and didn't say anything else. But the nodding continued for a moment after he'd stopped eating. The judging took the better part of an hour, and Maeve stood at her station and cleaned up and didn't let herself think too much about what the scores were doing. Decker came over and stood beside her with his crutch and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. Silas made his way through the crowd to where she was, arriving without announcement and standing on the other side of her station, and she was grateful for the physical fact of both of them being there without her having to ask. The crowd was restless in the way crowds get when they're waiting for something they've already made up their minds about. She could hear the shape of the consensus forming. There were enough alderman supporters and Hale allies in the square that the expectation was clearly running in one direction. She heard her name once, and then a laugh, and she didn't look for the source. When the head judge, a dry-voiced man named Carver, who'd been running the competition for 7 years, stood on the raised platform to announce the results, the square went quiet. Third place went to the woman from Granton. Second place went to Eleanor Alderman. Carver paused then, in the way that people in official positions pause when they know what they're about to say is going to change the temperature of the room, and then he said Maeve Dalton's name. The silence that followed was its own kind of sound. She walked up to the platform and shook Carver's hand and took the ribbon and stood there while Carver said something about the judge's notes, something about the quality of the broth, and the technique, and the way the dish demonstrated a kind of mastery that prioritized substance over presentation. And she looked out at 200 faces, and approximately half of them were wearing the expression of people who had just been told something they didn't want to hear and weren't entirely sure what to do about it. Eleanor Alderman, in the crowd, had the composed face of a woman who had been raised to handle disappointment without showing it. She looked at Maeve with something that was not respect exactly, but was at least the acknowledgement you give to something that you've had to revise your opinion of. The other half of the crowd, the half that hadn't come with a predetermined outcome, started to applaud. And it wasn't the polite kind. It was the kind that builds, and Decker's voice came from somewhere in the crowd saying something she couldn't make out, but loud enough that the people around him laughed. She walked back down from the platform. Victor Hale was waiting at the base of it. She knew him immediately, even though she'd never met him. You generally knew men like Victor Hale on sight. It was something in the bearing, in the way they stood in a space like the space had been arranged to accommodate them. He was in his mid-50s, well-dressed, with the look of a man who'd been told he was important often enough, and early enough that he'd built his personality around it. He had good eyes, cold and precise, and he looked at her with them now as she stepped off the platform. "Miss Dalton," he said. "Mr. Hale," she said, because she was fairly certain who he was. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't involve warmth. Impressive performance. "Thank you. I'm sure it won't be the last impression you make in this county." He said it with the specific intonation that turned a compliment into the opposite. "Though I'd encourage you to consider whether the attention you're drawing is the kind that benefits the people around you. Silas Mercer is a man with a great deal at stake. It would be unfortunate if his association with unconventional choices were to cause him difficulties he couldn't recover from." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Hale, are you threatening Silas's livelihood in the middle of the town square at a public event?" Something shifted in his expression. The smile stayed, but it tightened. "I'm offering perspective," he said. "As a community leader." "That's a kind way to describe it." She held his gaze. "I appreciate the perspective." "But," she walked around him. She heard him say, behind her, at a volume calibrated for the people standing nearby rather than for her, "Enjoy it while it lasts." Silas was 10 feet away, and she could tell from the angle of his body that he'd heard every word and that he was making the deliberate decision not to go toward Hale, which was the right decision and was costing him something. She reached him and they stood side by side for a moment, looking out at the square. "You heard that?" she said. "I heard it," he said. "You okay?" "A beat." "No," he said, honestly. "But I'll be fine in a minute." She almost laughed at that, at the blunt accuracy of it, and she turned away to hide the edge of the smile because this wasn't really a smiling moment. The crowd was already reconfiguring around the aftermath of the announcement. She could see the patterns, the Hale allies clustered in groups, talking in the low, urgent way of people recalculating. But she could also see something else, something that hadn't been there before. The woman who'd lent her the time was talking to two other women and gesturing toward Maeve's station. A man she didn't recognize had stopped Crow near the feed store side of the square and was talking to him, and from Crow's body language it was a friendly conversation. The judge from Ridgewood was standing near the platform talking to Carver, and once he looked in her direction in a way that wasn't hostile. The balance in the room had shifted. Not dramatically, not permanently, not in the way that fixed anything. But it had shifted. Decker made his way over on his crutch, slightly out of breath from moving through the crowd. "You won," he said, as though she might not have been aware. "I noticed," she said. "Eleanor Alderman looked like she bit into something bad." "Decker, I'm just saying what I observed." Crow arrived behind him. "Got 3 people asking about Iron Creek beef," he said without preamble. 2 ranchers and a buyer from Granton. They want to talk to Silas," he paused. "And a woman from out near Ridgewood wants to know if we sell eggs." Silas said, "We don't." "I told her that. She said she'd pay good money if we started." Crow looked at Maeve. "You're doing whatever that stew was, it opened some doors." She looked at the ribbon in her hand. Plain blue, nothing special, the kind of thing that would fade and soften with time. She turned it over once and then tucked it into her apron pocket. The square was loud around them, and the afternoon light was going amber, and Victor Hale was still there somewhere at the edges of things, recalibrating, and the supply situation was still only half resolved, and there were still 2 fewer hands than there should have been, and nothing that had been hard before the competition was magically easier because she'd won a ribbon. But when she looked at the crowd now, at the 200 faces that had watched her walk up to that platform, something was different than it had been this morning. She'd stood in the middle of the thing. She'd made them look at her directly, and what they'd seen, whether they'd wanted to or not, was a woman who could do the work. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, the kind of thing that was difficult to unsee. On the way back through the square toward the wagon, a boy of about 10 stepped out from beside his mother and held something out to Maeve, a small piece of cornbread, one of the samples the judges had left after scoring. He didn't say anything, just held it out with the earnest directness of a child who hadn't yet learned to make gestures complicated. She took it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded solemnly and went back to his mother, who was watching Maeve with an expression that took her a moment to place because she'd seen so few expressions like it recently. It was the expression of a woman who was reconsidering something. Maeve walked on through the crowd, the ribbon in her pocket and the cornbread in her hand, and Silas on one side of her and Decker and Crow behind. And the sound of the square fell away behind them as they moved toward the wagon. And she thought about what Victor Hale had said. "Enjoy it while it lasts." And she thought that was probably not an idle comment, that he was already planning what came next. That winning a cooking competition was not the same as winning whatever the larger thing was that they were in the middle of. She knew that. She wasn't confused about it. But she also knew that 2 months ago she'd walked into this town with 43 cents in a canvas bag and been turned away from every door she tried. And today she'd stood on a platform in the middle of that same town square and won something in front of everyone who'd turned her away. And she'd done it with her mother's recipe and borrowed time and not one apology for being exactly who she was. Whatever Hale was planning, she would deal with it when it arrived. Right now she had a ranch to get back to, and supper to think about, and a kitchen that was hers, and a crew that would be hungry at 6, and a crutch-hobbling 17-year-old behind her who was going to talk about Eleanor Alderman's face for the next 2 weeks, whether she encouraged it or not. She handed Decker the piece of cornbread. "What's this for?" he said. "For not saying, 'Are you sure?' when I told you I was making stew." He took it and ate it in 2 bites, and didn't say anything, which was the right answer. The wagon rolled out of Blackridge as the sun went low, and behind them the town sat with what it had seen. And somewhere in it, Victor Hale was doing the math on what came next, and the math was going to come out badly for someone. Maeve sat on the wagon bench and felt the road under the wheels, and thought about the full pot and the intention, and how her mother had been right about that. The way her mother had been right about most things, and how the trouble with being right about most things was that you had to keep proving it over and over, in kitchens and town squares and all the spaces in between, without ever getting to stop. She was tired. She was also, somewhere underneath the tired, something that was harder to name, not happy exactly, not triumphant, but solid, grounded in herself in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. The road stretched ahead toward Iron Creek, 5 miles of valley and dry grass, and the first signs of fall coming in on the cooler air, and she rode it with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the horizon and let the evening come. Victor Hale moved faster than she'd expected, which, in retrospect, she should have anticipated. Men like him didn't recalibrate slowly. They absorbed the information that the woman they'd been trying to push out had just won the county competition in front of 200 witnesses, and they adjusted. And the adjustment came hard and quick before the momentum could build any further against them. The first sign was the bank. Silas came back from Blackridge on a Thursday, 10 days after the competition, and he came back quieter than he'd left, which was saying something because Silas Mercer was not a loud man to begin with. Maeve was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horse, and she looked up and saw the set of his shoulders before she saw his face, and she set down the trowel and went to meet him. He didn't say anything until they were inside, until he'd poured himself water and stood at the work table with the cup in his hand. Then he said, "Calloway called the loan." She sat down on the stool. "The operating loan?" "The full note. Says there's been a review of the account and they're requiring immediate repayment or they'll move on the property." He set the cup down. "Calloway's been our bank for 4 years. Never a problem. Never a late payment." "Calloway and Hale," she said. "Hale's got money in the bank. Has for years. I knew that, He stopped. "I didn't think he'd move on the loan. That's a different kind of thing than cutting off suppliers." She looked at him. His jaw was tight, and his eyes had the particular flatness of a man who was calculating options and not liking any of them. "How much time did Calloway give you?" 60 days. "Can you get it refinanced somewhere else?" "Maybe. There's a bank out of Ridgewood that's been expanding, but it'll take time to arrange, and I'd need someone to vouch for the operation." He rubbed his hand across his jaw. "I've got feelers out, nothing solid yet." The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, she could hear Decker, off his crutch now, though not fully easy on the leg yet, working near the barn. The ranch sounds that had become, over the past 2 months, as familiar to her as her own breathing. "There's something else," Silas said. She waited. "I heard in town that Hale's been talking to a land buyer, a man from back east named Pryor. Apparently Pryor's been looking to acquire ranch land in this valley for a consolidated grazing operation, and Hale's been steering him toward Iron Creek specifically." He looked at her. "If the bank calls the note, and I can't refinance in 60 days, Pryor moves in with a low offer, and I either take it or lose the property to the bank anyway." The geometry of it was neat and ugly. Cut off the supplies, intimidate the hands, poison the reputation, then use the bank to force a sale to a buyer you've already arranged. She'd seen versions of this before, in other places, in other forms. Men with money and connections didn't need to be violent when they had that kind of leverage. They could just tighten the ring slowly and wait. "What would it take to get the Ridgewood Bank interested?" she asked. "Proof the operation is viable. Good cattle numbers, stable income, evidence of expansion potential." He paused. "And probably a reference from someone they respect." "The buyers at the competition," she said. "The ones Crow talked to. The man from Granton." "Possibly." He looked at her with an expression she was starting to know, not quite surprise, more like the look of a man who'd gotten used to being alone with his problems and was still adjusting to having someone think through them alongside him. "I was going to talk to them this week. Do it tomorrow," she said, "and let me come." He looked like he was going to say something about that, maybe something about whether that was necessary or wise, given that her presence in public had become politically complicated. Instead, he said, "All right." She got up and went back to the stove because supper was in 40 minutes, and she didn't have the luxury of letting problems displace the work. But she moved through the rest of the prep with a part of her attention on what Silas had said, running the numbers, thinking about what 60 days looked like and what could be built in that time and what couldn't. She was still thinking about it at 10 o'clock when she banked the fire, and she was thinking about it when she finally lay down and the ranch was dark and quiet around her, and somewhere in the thinking she fell asleep. They went to Granton on a Friday, and it went better than she'd feared and worse than she'd hoped, which was the usual shape of things. The buyer, a man named Aldous Greer, no relation to the Aldermans, a self-made cattle trader with a direct manner and no apparent investment in the county's social politics, met them at his office and shook both their hands without visible hesitation and listened to what Silas had to say about Iron Creek's numbers and prospects. He asked questions for about 30 minutes. Good questions, specific ones about carrying capacity and water access, and the quality of the stock and the condition of the infrastructure. Silas answered them straight, including the parts that weren't favorable. The fence work still in progress, the 2 hands they were short, the supply situation that was still only partly resolved. Greer looked at Maeve at one point and said, "You're the cook who won the competition." "I am," she said. "My wife was there. She said the stew was the best thing she'd eaten in 3 years. He said it like a business fact. "She also said there was some trouble. Someone going through your supplies." "That's right." "Hales people?" "I can't prove it," she said. He looked at her for a moment and then at Silas. "Hale's been overstepping for a while now," he said. "It's starting to affect people beyond just the people he's targeting. I've had 2 suppliers in this county tell me they're losing business because of how he's been applying pressure." A pause. "I'll buy your winter lot at market rate, and I'll put that in writing before you leave today. Take that to the Ridgewood Bank. I know the manager there, man named Forsgren, and tell him Greer vouched for the operation. That should move things along." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he asked. Not ungrateful, just direct. Greer looked at him. "Because Hale's been playing king in this county for too long and he's starting to cost me money, and anything that reminds people they have options is good for business." He stood up. "Also because my wife would not forgive me if I let the stew woman's ranch go under." He said it deadpan. Maeve almost laughed, which she covered by looking at the wall. They left Granton with the written purchase agreement in Silas's coat and the name of the Ridgewood bank manager and the first real solid footing they'd had since the competition. It wasn't a solution. 60 days was still 60 days and the refinancing wasn't arranged yet. But it was a tool, and having a tool was different from having nothing. On the ride back, the valley spreading out around them in the late afternoon, Silas said, "You should have been the one negotiating." She looked at him sideways. "You did fine. You knew what question to ask and when to stop talking. That's most of negotiating," she said, "knowing when to stop talking." He glanced at her, and there was something in it that was more than the professional assessment she'd gotten used to from him. Something that had been building in the small increments of early mornings and shared suppers and the specific closeness that comes from fighting the same fight together. She didn't say anything about it, and neither did he, but it sat between them on the wagon bench like a third passenger, present and acknowledged and not yet named. Hale's final move came 16 days later, and it came at night. Maeve woke to the smell first. She'd been a cook long enough that smoke registered before she was fully conscious, and she was out of her bed into the window before she understood what she was seeing. The eastern outbuilding, the one they used for equipment storage, was on fire. Not smoldering, not the early orange glow of something just catching. Fully burning, with the kind of intensity that said it had been burning long enough before the smell reached her that it had a real hold on the structure. She was moving before she'd finished processing it. Out of the room, down the hall, hammering on doors. "Fire! East storage! Everyone up now." She was already at the back door when she heard Silas's door open behind her. What followed was the particular chaos of a fire on a working ranch at night. Not panic exactly, because most of these men had dealt with worse, but the fast, ugly scramble of trying to contain something that didn't want to be contained. Silas had the crew organized and on water within minutes, a bucket line from the main pump, and for a while it looked like they might keep it from spreading. Then Maeve saw the men at the fence line, 4 of them, maybe 5, on horseback at the edge of the property. Not helping, just watching. One of them had something in his hand. She couldn't see what in the dark and the firelight, but they weren't there by accident, and they weren't neighbors who'd seen the smoke. She went to Silas. "There are men at the eastern fence," she said, low and close to his ear under the noise of the fire. "On horses. Watching." He turned and looked. His face in the firelight was unreadable for a moment. Then he said to Crow, "Keep the line going," and he started toward the fence. "Silas." She caught his arm. "There are 5 of them." "I know the math," he said. "Then you know you need someone with you." He looked at her for exactly long enough to determine that she wasn't going to move, and then he said, "Stay behind me," and went. They crossed the yard in the noise and light of the fire, and the men at the fence didn't ride off, which was either confidence or a miscalculation. The one in front was big, broad across the chest, with a hat pulled low. Not Hale. Hale didn't do his own dirty work, but men who knew who had sent them. "You're on Iron Creek property," Silas said. His voice was flat and completely calm, which was somehow more intimidating than anger would have been. "Just riding through," the man in front said. "That fire started from this side of the fence," Silas said, "which means you weren't just riding through." The man didn't answer that. He looked at Silas and then, briefly, at Maeve, and something in the look told her that her being there was noted, probably reported back to Hale later as evidence of something or other. "You've done what you came to do," Silas said. "The building's going. Ride off now, and we end it here tonight. You stay, and I'm going to make sure every person in this county knows exactly who was sitting at my fence line watching my property burn." A silence that stretched about 10 seconds, which felt much longer. The man at the front made a small gesture, and the group turned their horses and rode off into the dark without hurrying, with the particular unhurriedness of men who wanted you to know they weren't scared of you. Silas watched them go. Then he turned back to the fire. They saved the structure, barely, and not all of it. The eastern wall was gone and part of the roof, and 2 pieces of equipment were damaged beyond repair. But the fire didn't spread to the barn or the house, and nobody was hurt. And by 2 a.m, they had it out, and the crew was sitting in the yard exhausted and black with smoke, and nobody was talking much. Maeve made coffee. It was the only thing she could do, and it was the right thing, and she did it without being asked, moving through the kitchen that smelled of the smoke that had drifted in through the windows, making enough for everyone and carrying it out to the yard where the crew sat in the dark. She handed cups around, and nobody said thank you, and she didn't need them to. Silas took his cup and looked at the ruined outbuilding, just a black shape against the darker sky now, and his face in the moonlight was tired and hard and something else. Something held tight that she recognized as grief, the specific grief of a person watching a place they built get taken apart. "We'll file with the county sheriff in the morning," she said. "Sheriff Prentice is Hale's man," he said. "It was just a fact, no self-pity in it." "I know, we file anyway, we make it official. We document everything, those riders, the timing, the damage." She sat down on the ground next to where he was standing because she was too tired to stay upright. "And then we take all of it to Ridgewood, along with Greer's letter when we talk to Forsgren about the refinancing." He looked down at her. "Tonight?" "Not tonight. Tomorrow." She looked up at him. "Sit down, Silas. You're making my neck hurt." Something moved in his face, exhaustion, and something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to it, and he sat down on the ground beside her, which was not a thing she'd seen him do before, just sit on the ground like a normal person. And for a while they just sat there with their coffee in the ruins of the night, and the crew around them, and the smoke still rising thin and pale from what was left of the east wall. "I'm sorry," he said, not looking at her, looking at the building. "For what?" "For this being part of what you walked into." She thought about that. "I walked into it on purpose," she said. "Both times, the ranch and whatever this is now. I knew it wasn't going to be easy." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not what I meant." She waited. "I meant—" He stopped, started again. "You're here because I hired you. What's coming at this ranch is coming partly because of you, but it started before you. The bank situation, Hale's ambitions, the pressure on the property, that was building before you walked up that road." Another pause. And now it's your fight too, because you're here and I... He stopped again. Silas, she said, if you're trying to apologize for me being involved in something difficult, you can stop. I don't need protecting from difficulty. I know that, he said quickly. That's not... He ran his hand through his hair, which had ash in it. I'm trying to say something else and I'm doing it badly. She looked at him. In the pale light, he looked like himself, which was to say, worn and capable and not comfortable with what he was trying to say. And she waited. I'm glad you're here, he said. That's the thing. Under all of it, the bank, the fire, hail, all of it. I'm glad you're here, and I haven't said that plainly, and I should have. She was quiet for a moment. I'm glad I'm here too, she said. That's also true. They sat with that for a while, then she said, You've got ash in your hair. I know, he said. You look terrible. I'm aware. I mean genuinely bad. Like something the fire rejected. He did laugh then, short and real, and it cut through the weight of the night, and she felt it do that, felt the way it changed the air around them slightly. Around the yard, the crew was starting to move, people getting up, heading to their bunks. The particular slow movement of exhausted people who have done everything that could be done, and are now just bodies that need sleep. Crow walked past them and looked down at the two of them sitting on the ground and said nothing, but his expression said several things. Decker lingered near the barn door, and Maeve caught his eye and tilted her head toward the bunkhouse, and he went. But 3 days later, the storm came in off the mountains, the kind that didn't announce itself with much warning, just a fast darkening of the western sky, and a drop in temperature, and then the wind, and then the rain coming in sideways and hard. It was Crow who heard the cattle first, the particular sound of a herd that had startled, that was moving wrong. He came to the house at a dead run and got Silas. And within 10 minutes, the available hands were out in it, trying to get ahead of what was shaping up to be a stamped on the southern pasture. Maeve stayed in the house for about 4 minutes. Then she went out. She wasn't a ranch hand. She'd been clear about that from the beginning. Her job was the kitchen and the provisions and the small medical knowledge she carried, not cattle work. But the storm was bad, and she could count. And the count of people out there against the number of cattle moving in the wrong direction didn't add up to anything good. She found a horse in the barn that Silas had left because it was older and slightly lame and not fast enough for the work he needed. She could ride, but not well, not the way these men could ride, but well enough to be useful, or at least to not make things worse. She took the horse and went. What she found in the southern pasture was controlled chaos in the worst possible weather conditions. Rain reducing visibility to about 30 feet, lightning making the cattle worse with every strike, the ground turning slick and treacherous, and the hands trying to hold the flank of the herd and redirect it away from the ravine at the south end of the pasture, which was a straight drop of 15 feet into rock and water. She saw Silas on the far side of the herd, moving along the edge of the stampede on his horse, and she understood what he was doing, trying to turn the lead animals, which was the right move, but it put him directly in the path of the herd's momentum if the turn didn't work. She saw the moment his horse went down. The animal's front legs went out on the slick ground, and Silas went over its head and hit the ground, and the horse scrambled up and ran, and Silas was on the ground in the dark with a few hundred cattle moving toward him through the rain. She didn't think. She moved. The older horse she was on was not fast, and it was not agile, but it was big, and it knew cattle, and when she pointed it towards Silas, it went without much argument. She came in at an angle to the herd's edge, close enough that she could feel the ground shaking under the hooves, and she got to Silas and she was off the horse and pulling at him before she'd fully stopped. "Get up," she said. "Get up right now." He was conscious but stunned, and he came up slow, and she had her arm under his and his weight against her side, and they moved. She couldn't have said later how they moved, only that they did, that her legs found the ground and her arms held, and they got clear of the path of the herd by maybe 20 feet before the main body of the cattle swept past where they'd been standing. The sound was enormous. The ground shook. Rain and mud and the smell of terrified animals, and she had her face turned into Silas's shoulder, and his arm was around her so hard it hurt. And then it was past, the herd flowing around the edge of the turn that Crow and the others had managed to hold, and the thunder of it diminished, and they were still standing. She became aware that she was shaking. That surprised her a little, the shaking, because she hadn't felt afraid exactly while it was happening. But her body apparently had its own accounting, and it was settling that account now. Silas's arm was still around her. He was looking at her in the dark and the rain with an expression she couldn't fully see in the conditions but could feel in some way she couldn't have explained. "Maeve," he said, just her name, the way you'd say something irreplaceable. "Don't," she said, because if he said whatever he was going to say right now, with the rain and the shaking and the near miss of what had just happened, she wasn't going to be able to hold herself together properly. And there were still cattle to account for, and hands to check on, and a very long, wet night still ahead of them. "All right," he said, but his arm didn't move. She let herself lean against him for a moment. Just a moment, 30 seconds maybe, just long enough to let the shaking settle. Then she straightened and he let his arm drop, and they both looked out at the dark pasture where the herd was now mostly halted, milling in the rain, the hands working the edges to keep them settled. "Can you walk?" she said. He moved experimentally. "Yes." "Good." She picked up her horse's reins, which it had been patiently holding while she had no attention for it. "Let's go make sure nobody else went down." He caught her arm before she could move off. Not hard, just enough to stop her for a second. "I'm not going to not say it," he said. "I'll say it when the night's over, but I'm going to say it." She looked at him. Her heart was doing something she wished it would stop doing. "All right," she said, which was what she had instead of anything more coherent. And they went. The night did end, eventually. The cattle were accounted for, too lost in the confusion, which was bad but not catastrophic. And the hands were all standing, bruised and exhausted and soaked through, and the storm moved off east by about 4 in the morning and left the valley clean and cold and quiet. The crew got dry and got fed. Maeve made what she could fast, eggs and bacon, and enough coffee for twice the number of people. And by 5 in the morning, the bunkhouse was quiet, and the house was quiet, and it was only Silas sitting at the kitchen table with his third cup of coffee when she came back in from checking on the horses. She sat down across from him. He looked at her for a long moment. His hair was still damp, and he had a bruise forming along his jaw from when he'd hit the ground, and he looked like a man who had been through a bad night, which he had been. "I've been thinking about saying it wrong," he said, "which is why I haven't said it yet." "Just say it," she said. "However it comes out." He put his cup down. "I'm in love with you," he said. "I don't know exactly when that happened. Somewhere between the first morning and the fire, I think. Probably earlier than I realized." He held her gaze. "I'm not saying that to complicate your position here, or to... It's not about the job or the ranch or any of that. It's just... You should know. You should know what I'm thinking when I look at you." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was starting somewhere in the gray pre-dawn. She'd known it was coming. She'd felt it building for weeks, in the early mornings and the conversations on the porch and the way he'd said her name in the rain. Knowing it was coming didn't make it uncomplicated. "Silas," she said, "I'm not a simple situation." "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking for simple. There are people in this county who are going to say things about you, about your judgment, about what it means that you..." She stopped. "I come with noise. I always have. And I don't know how to be less of what I am to make that easier." "I don't want you to be less of what you are," he said. And then, more quietly, "I never have." She looked at him across the table. The man who'd offered her 3 days when no one would offer her a single night, who'd sat on the ground with her in the dark after the fire, who'd stood between her and Hale without being asked. She thought about running. She thought about how good she was at it, how practiced, how it was always the option that was immediately available. Then she thought about 5 miles of road in the afternoon heat, and a kitchen that needed cleaning, and a boy with a broken leg and a blue ribbon, and her mother's recipe for lamb stew, and she thought about the full pot and the intention, and she thought about the look on Silas's face when the herd had swept past, and he'd found her still standing. "I'm staying," she said. "That's what I can tell you right now. I'm staying, and the rest of it..." She shook her head. "I'm not good at this part." "Neither am I," he said. "I haven't been good at this part in a long time." "Then we'll be bad at it together," she said. "And figure it out." The bird outside got louder. The sky in the kitchen window was going from black to deep gray, the first gray of a morning coming in clean after a storm, and the coffee was hot, and the ranch was quiet around them. He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, and they sat there while the morning came, and neither of them said anything else because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said right then. It was 2 weeks after that conversation, 2 weeks of the refinancing moving forward in Ridgewood, of Greer's letter doing the work it was supposed to do, of Forsgren at the Ridgewood Bank proving to be a practical man without political debts to Victor Hale, when the investigation started. It came from outside the county, which was part of why it had teeth. A territorial inspector named Walsh, who had been quietly building a case for the better part of a year, arrived in Blackridge with documents that turned out to be the ledgers of Victor Hale's various financial arrangements. The coercive loans, the forced supplier contracts, the land acquisition scheme with the Eastern buyer prior, and underneath all of it, something uglier still. Falsified cattle records going back 6 years, fraudulent land grants on 3 separate properties, and money that had moved through the county bank under Calloway's signature in ways that were going to be very difficult for either Calloway or Hale to explain. Silas heard about it first from the writer who brought the Weekly Post, who'd heard it in town, who'd heard it from the sheriff's deputy, who had the particular look on his face of a man wondering how he'd ended up working for someone who was now in this much trouble. He came into the kitchen and told Maeve. She was rolling biscuit dough. She kept rolling it. Walsh is out of the territorial office, she said. Yes. That means it goes above the county. Prentice can't bury it. No. She cut the first round of biscuits and set them on the pan. What happens to the loan call? Calloway's in enough trouble that he's not going to be pressing anyone about anything for a while, Silas said. Walsh has already put a hold on any active foreclosure proceedings pending the investigation. She cut the second round. The land buyer, Pryor. Gone, Silas said. Left the territory 2 days ago, from what the writer said. The deal was contingent on the foreclosure going through. No foreclosure, no deal. She put the pan in the oven and wiped her hands on her apron and turned around to look at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with the post in his hand and an expression on his face that was not triumph. She'd known him long enough to know he wasn't a man who wore triumph easily, but something quieter and more permanent. Relief, maybe. The particular relief of a person who had been holding something very heavy for a long time and had just been allowed to set it down. It's not over, she said, because it wasn't. Investigations took time. Hale would have lawyers. The county would take time to reorganize itself around the absence of the power that had been running it. But it's starting to come apart. Yes, he said. She looked at him. How are you? He thought about it, really thought about it. The way she'd learned he did when she asked him a direct question, not reaching for the quick answer, but actually checking. Tired, he said. And he paused. Relieved. Like you said, it's the right word. Good. She turned back to the stove. Tell Decker there are biscuits in 20 minutes. He's been hanging around the barn pretending to check on that fence post for the last hour. How do you know that? Because I know Decker, she said. And I know what biscuit anticipation looks like. He laughed. Short, real, the laugh she'd come to recognize as his actual one rather than the polite version. And she listened to him walk down the hall and out the back door, and she stood in her kitchen in the quiet morning and looked at the wall and breathed. The oven was warm. The biscuits were rising. The ranch was standing. She'd deal with everything else as it came. The investigation into Victor Hale's affairs took 4 months to move through the territorial system, which was 4 months of uncertainty that Maeve and Silas learned to live inside of without letting it eat them. That was harder than it sounds. There were weeks when the ranch felt like it was holding its breath, when a rider came up the road and everyone paused what they were doing to see what he was carrying, when the mail brought nothing useful, and the waiting stretched another 7 days into itself. But the work didn't stop for the waiting, and that was the saving of them. Cattle still needed tending. Fences still needed mending. The kitchen garden had come back stronger than expected in the late season, and Maeve had expanded it by half again, taking over a section of neglected ground near the south wall of the house that nobody had been using for anything. Decker, whose leg had healed clean and straight. Doctor. Elling had said as much at the follow-up visit, had said the field splinting had been done as well as he could have done himself, which was the closest thing to a compliment the man apparently gave. had started helping her in the garden in the mornings before the regular ranch work started. He didn't explain why. She didn't ask. He just started showing up with a shovel at 5:15 one morning, and she'd pointed at the section that needed turning, and that had been that. Silas noticed because Silas noticed most things. He said one evening on the porch, "You're turning that boy into a cook." "I'm turning him into someone who pays attention," she said. "What he does with that is up to him." He told Crow he's thinking about opening a restaurant someday. She didn't say anything, but she felt something warm move through her chest at that. The particular satisfaction of watching a small thing you planted start to grow in a direction you hadn't anticipated. The days got shorter as the season turned, and the ranch found a rhythm that was different from the anxious survival rhythm of the summer. The Ridgewood refinancing had gone through in October. Forsgren had been as practical as Silas had hoped, had looked at the numbers and at Greer's letter and at the documentation of Hale's interference, and had made a straightforward business decision uncomplicated by county politics. The new loan was at a better rate than the Callaway note had been, which was a specific kind of justice that Maeve appreciated. 2 new hands had come on in late October, men who'd heard about Iron Creek through the network of ranch workers that moved through the territory, men who'd specifically heard about what had happened over the summer and had their own feelings about the kind of operation they wanted to work for. One of them, a quiet man named Teller, had been let go from his previous position for reasons that sounded, when he told the story plainly over supper on his first night, remarkably like what Maeve had experienced in Blackridge, a different kind of difference, a different kind of exclusion, but the same architecture of it. She hadn't said much about that. She just made sure his plate was full and the coffee was strong. Crow had watched that dinner from his usual seat at the end of the table and said, later, when they were cleaning up, "You did that on purpose. Hiring him." "Silas hired him," she said. "Silas hired him because you told Silas he was worth hiring." Crow picked up a dish to dry. "Don't be modest about it. It doesn't suit you." She almost smiled. "He's a good worker," she said. "That's the only criteria." "That's the only criteria on this ranch," Crow said. "Which is not how most ranches work, and you know it." She did know it. She'd worked at enough of those other ranches. Bon. Walsh, the territorial inspector, delivered his findings in the second week of December. And the findings were, as Silas had predicted and Maeve had calculated, more comprehensive than most people in the county had expected. Victor Hale was formally charged with falsification of land records, fraudulent management of county funds, and coercive business practices that had affected 11 separate operations in the territory over 6 years. Callaway at the bank was charged separately as a co-conspirator in the loan manipulation scheme. Maeve heard the official details the same way she'd heard most things over the summer, sideways, through the network of people who came through or passed by or sent word. But she also heard something else that traveled alongside the official news, something that moved through the county in a different register. She heard it first from the woman at the competition, the one who'd lent her the time. Her name was Ruth Crandall, and she'd been at the edge of the Iron Creek story since September, one of the people who'd started recalculating after the competition. She came out to the ranch on a cold December morning, which itself said something, because the road from Blackridge in December was not comfortable, and she'd made the trip anyway. She sat in the kitchen and accepted coffee and said, "People are talking differently now." Maeve sat down across from her. "Talking how?" "About the summer. About what happened." Ruth turned her cup. "People who went along with what Hale was doing, who passed along his stories about you, who stayed away from Silas's operation because Hale told them to, they're doing that thing that people do when they've been caught in something they knew was wrong while they were doing it. Justifying themselves," Maeve said. "Some of them. Others," Ruth paused, "others are just sitting with it, which is rarer and, I think, more honest." She looked at Maeve directly. "I'm one of the ones sitting with it. I heard things about you and I didn't go looking for the other side of it. I stayed away from the question because it was easier." She put her hands flat on the table. "I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm telling you that I know what I did and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise." Maeve looked at her for a long moment. Ruth Crandall had given her time when she needed it. That was also true. "The time mattered," Maeve said. "At the competition. You didn't have to give it." "That was small," Ruth said. Small things usually are, Maeve said. Doesn't mean they don't count. Ruth nodded slowly. She finished her coffee and got up to leave, and at the door she stopped and said, "There's going to be a council meeting in January. New council, after everything with Hale. They're talking about what the county owes the operations that were affected. Silas should be there." A pause. "You should be there too." Maeve didn't answer right away. "I'll think about it," she said. "Don't think too long," Ruth said. "People need to see you, not the story they made up about you. You." She left. Maeve stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her ride back down the road, and thought about that, about what it meant to be seen rather than storied. She'd spent most of her life as someone else's story. The too big woman, the unwanted worker, the interloper, the problem. She'd learned to live around those stories, to work in spite of them, to be more than them without ever quite being free of them. She wondered if that ever fully changed. She suspected it didn't. She suspected that what changed was something smaller and more durable, not the absence of the stories, but the degree to which you let them determine what you did next. Silas asked her to marry him on a Tuesday, which was the least romantic day of the week, and therefore completely in character. They were in the kitchen. She was making bread. He was sitting with his morning coffee, which had become the most constant thing in her days, that early morning quiet with him at the table and the fire going and the ranch still half asleep outside. He'd been working up to something for about 3 days. She could tell because he was quieter than usual, which was significant given that his usual was already quiet, and he kept looking at her with the particular expression of a man rehearsing something he couldn't quite get right in his head. She let him work up to it in his own time because she'd learned that much about him. On the Tuesday morning, he set down his cup and looked at her across the work table and said, "Maeve, I want to marry you, if that's something you'd want too." She kept her hands in the dough. She worked it for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not going to be easy to be married to." "I know that," he said. "I have opinions about everything, and I express them." "I've noticed," he said, dry as dust. "I'll run this kitchen the way I run it. I'm not going to change how I work because there's a ring involved." "I wouldn't want you to." She looked up at him. He was watching her with the patient steadiness that was the most characteristic thing about him, the quality that had been the first thing she'd recognized when she walked up that road and found him driving fence posts, a man who did not push, who waited, who believed that things worth waiting for were worth being still for. She thought about 43 cents and 5 miles of road. She thought about the cold store in the dark, and the biscuits that first morning, and Decker's face when he tasted the broth. She thought about a county competition and borrowed time and a blue ribbon she still had in the drawer of her nightstand. She thought about the storm and the mud and his arm around her and the bird that started singing when the morning came in clean after everything. She thought about her mother, who had taught her to cook and to read injuries and to make the full pot with intention, and who had never gotten to see what Maeve made of the things she'd been given. "Yes," she said, "that's something I'd want." He didn't make a production of it. He just nodded, like she'd confirmed something he'd believed but needed to hear, and picked up his coffee cup. Then he said, "Your bread's going to overproof." "I know," she said, and went back to work. They married in March, at the ranch, which was the right place for it. Not in Blackridge. Neither of them had any interest in performing anything for that particular audience, but at Iron Creek, in the yard, with the crew and Ruth Crandall and Aldous Greer and Dr. Elling and a handful of others who had proven themselves people worth having around. Crow stood up with Silas, which made Crow uncharacteristically formal and slightly uncomfortable, which everyone except Crow found extremely funny. Decker cried, which he denied afterward and continued to deny for years. It was a simple ceremony and the food was extraordinary, because Maeve had made it herself. She'd refused help. Had spent 2 days in the kitchen producing the kind of meal that made the distinction between cooking and feeding someone collapse into one single act. Lamb stew and 3 kinds of bread and a pie made with the dried apples from the kitchen garden that had come out better than she'd ever managed before, and coffee strong enough to sustain a small army. Ruth Crandall, eating her second piece of pie, said, "You should have a restaurant." Maeve looked at her. "What?" "I mean it. This..." Ruth gestured at the table, at everything on it. "This is what people drive 6 miles for. This is what they remember." She put down her fork. There's a building on 2nd Street in Blackridge that's been empty since Hale's operations collapsed. Good kitchen space. Big enough for 30 covers. She held Maeve's gaze. I'd invest. Maeve was quiet for a moment. This is my wedding day. I'm aware, Ruth said. I'm also aware that you're someone who doesn't stop thinking about the next thing just because the current thing is good. A pause. Am I wrong? She wasn't wrong. The building on 2nd Street became Dalton's table in the spring of the following year, which was not a fast process, and was not an easy one, and was not, at any point, something that went exactly according to plan, because nothing Maeve Dalton had ever done had gone exactly according to plan, and she was at peace with that. The kitchen needed work, not as much as Iron Creek's had when she arrived, but work nonetheless. She did most of it herself, with Decker helping on weekends. The two of them stripped down to working clothes and going at the place until it was what she needed it to be. Silas came on Saturdays with lumber and opinions about the structural stuff, and she let him have the structural opinions and held her ground on everything else, which was the exact same negotiation they had at home and which seemed to suit them both. Ruth's investment covered the building lease and the initial equipment. Greer put in a smaller amount with no conditions attached and refused to be called a patron, saying it was a business investment, and he expected a return, which was his way of being generous without calling it that. Maeve understood that and was grateful for it in the way she was grateful for the time, quietly and specifically. She hired 3 people to start. A girl named Ida, 17, who'd come to the ranch door 2 months earlier looking for work the way Maeve had once come to every door in Blackridge, and who could chop vegetables faster than anyone Maeve had ever seen. A man named Grady, who'd been a cook for a mining operation and had the particular resourcefulness of someone who'd been making meals work under impossible conditions for 20 years. And Decker, who protested that he was a ranch hand and not a restaurant worker, and who showed up every morning at 5 regardless, because some things are decided by what you do rather than what you say about yourself. The restaurant opened on a Wednesday in April with no announcement, no ceremony, and a menu that was written on a chalkboard in Maeve's handwriting. 8 tables, lunch and dinner. The food was what it had always been. Honest, careful, built on technique that nobody had taught her in a school, but that lived in her hands and her mother's journal and the accumulated intelligence of years of feeding people who needed feeding. By Friday, the tables were full. By the following Wednesday, someone had ridden from Granton specifically because they'd heard about the place, which was the moment Maeve knew that whatever she was building, it had its own momentum now. The people who came were not universally the ones she'd have expected. Some of them were the same people who'd been in the crowd at the competition, the ones who'd started recalculating when she won. They came with the slightly complicated graciousness of people making a correction and not quite sure how to do it gracefully. She served them well. She didn't make it easy or hard, just served them the same food she served everyone, which was the only language she had for what she thought of the situation. Others were people she didn't know at all, people from outside the county or the outer edges of it, people who came because they'd heard and were curious, and who left because the food gave them something to think about on the ride home. Those were her favorite customers, if she was honest, the ones who arrived without a position already formed, and some of them were women. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated as specifically as she should have. Women who came to the restaurant not just to eat, but to watch her work, to see the kitchen, to ask questions. Young women, some of them, girls like Ida, who were trying to figure out what was available to them in a world that kept telling them the list was short. Women with their own dreams that the county's social arithmetic had told them were too large, or too inconvenient, or too incompatible with how they were supposed to move through space. One of them was a girl named Clara, who was 16 and had walked 4 miles from her family's place west of Blackridge, specifically to ask Maeve for work. She was thin and serious and not particularly talented with food yet, but she paid attention the way Decker had paid attention, with the specific hunger of someone who understood that paying attention was the most important skill she could develop right now. Maeve hired her. Her mother, a small, tired woman who came to the restaurant 2 weeks later, sat across from Maeve and said, "She talks about you every night at supper." "She's learning fast," Maeve said. "She wants to run her own kitchen someday." The woman looked at Maeve with an expression that mixed pride and anxiety, the way that only parents seem to manage simultaneously. Do you think that's something she could actually do?" Maeve thought about how to answer that honestly. I think Clara is the kind of person who decides what she's going to do and then does it, she said. The hard part for her isn't going to be the cooking. The hard part is going to be all the things that aren't the cooking. The people who tell her she can't, the places that turn her away before they've seen what she can do. She paused. That's true for most people worth watching. The woman looked at her. How did you get through that part? It was a real question, asked plainly by someone who wanted a real answer. Maeve thought about it. Not the polished version of the answer, not the version that made a good story. The actual answer, the honest one with all the rough edges still on it. I didn't always, she said. There were places I ran from when I should have stayed. There were times I let what people said about me become the loudest voice in the room, and I made decisions based on that voice instead of my own. I wasn't brave all the time. I was just stubborn, mostly. I kept going back to the thing I knew how to do, and eventually the stubbornness outlasted the people trying to stop me. She looked at the woman. That's not an inspiring story, but it's the true one. Claire's mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That sounds like the most inspiring story I've heard in a while, actually. Maeve looked at her and didn't have an answer for that, so she got up and poured them both more coffee, and they sat in the quiet of the early afternoon with the sound of the kitchen going behind them, and left it at that. Oops. The county council meeting happened in January, as Ruth had predicted, and Maeve went, as Ruth had said she should. It was held in the Blackridge Meeting Hall, a plain building that smelled of pine and old arguments, and there were 40 or 50 people in the seats when Silas and Maeve arrived. She felt the room recalibrate when she walked in, same as it always did. That small collective adjustment that she'd learned years ago she could not prevent, and therefore had learned to walk through rather than around. She sat in the front because she'd learned that the front was the better option when you had the choice. In the back, you were easier to ignore. The new council chair was a man named Alderman, not Eleanor's husband, a cousin from the Ridgewood branch of the family who'd run for the position after Hale's removal specifically to separate the Alderman name from the mess Hale had made of the county's reputation. He was cautious and politically careful and not particularly inspiring, but he was also not corrupt, which at this particular moment in the county's history was the quality most in demand. He opened the meeting with a statement about the investigation's findings, about the operations that had been affected, about what the county intended to do in terms of redress. It was a careful statement. It didn't use the words "we were wrong," but it was arranged around that fact the way a sentence is arranged around its meaning. When he finished, he opened the floor. Silas spoke, plainly and briefly, about the loan situation and the supply disruptions and the fire, the documented facts, nothing dramatized, just the record of what had happened. 3 other ranchers spoke after him about their own versions of the same story, different details, same structure, the same architecture of pressure and exclusion that Hale had run for 6 years. Then Alderman looked at Maeve and said, "Miss Dalton, or Mrs. Mercer, we're glad you're here." The formal use of her married name still landed a little strangely, the way new things do before they settle into familiar. "Maeve is fine," she said. "Maeve." He cleared his throat. "Is there anything you'd like to say to the council?" She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it for 2 days, actually, about what the right thing was, about what she actually wanted to say versus what would be useful versus what she'd regret not saying when she was sitting in this chair in 20 years thinking back on it. She stood up. "I walked into Blackridge with 43 cents in a bag," she said, and her voice was steady, not loud, the kind of voice that made people lean forward rather than back. "Every door I knocked on, I was turned away before I opened my mouth. Not because of my work history, not because of my character, because of how I looked." She looked at the room, at the faces she recognized and the ones she didn't. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel bad about it. I'm telling you because I want to be specific about what happened. It wasn't vague. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was a decision made by people in this room and people connected to this room that certain kinds of people didn't belong here." The room was very quiet. "Victor Hale made that worse," she said. "He organized it and amplified it and gave it economic force. But he didn't invent it. It was already here." She paused. "What I'd ask the council to consider is not just what you owe the operations that Hale damaged financially. That's important and I hope you get it right. But also what it looks like going forward. To be a county where someone walking in from the road gets a fair hearing before anyone's decided what they're worth. She sat back down. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then someone started clapping. She couldn't see who, it came from behind her. And then more people joined, and it wasn't the huge unanimous kind, it was the uneven and genuine kind, which was better. Alderman, at the front, looked like a man who was surprised to find himself moved by something and was trying to decide how to handle that professionally. He cleared his throat again. "Thank you," he said. "That was... thank you." Ruth, beside her, said quietly, "That was the right speech." "I wasn't sure," Maeve said. "I know. That's why it worked." The years moved the way years do on a working ranch. Not fast, not slow, but with the particular rhythm of seasons and labor and the accumulation of small things that don't seem significant until you look back and see the shape they've made together. The restaurant became what Ruth had predicted it would become, and then something more than that. Dalton's Table had, within 3 years, a reputation that went well outside the county. People came from Granton and Ridgewood, and once, memorably, a party from back east who were traveling through the territory and had heard about the place through a chain of recommendation that Maeve could never quite trace back to its source. The food was the same as it had always been, honest, careful, specific, made with the intention her mother had written about in the journal. Not fancy, worth remembering. Ida ran the lunch service by the time she was 20 with an efficiency that made Maeve quietly proud and publicly demanding, because the publicly demanding part was how you made someone actually good rather than just competent. Clara was in the kitchen by 18, and by 22 she'd taken over the bread program entirely and was doing things with it that Maeve hadn't taught her, hadn't thought of herself, because that was what happened when you hired someone with a real mind and got out of their way. Decker, who had started by helping in the garden and then helping in the kitchen, and then spending more hours in the restaurant than on the ranch, eventually said plainly one morning that he thought he was more a cook than a ranch hand and wanted to know what Maeve thought about that. "I think you've been a cook for 3 years," she said. "You were just waiting for permission to call yourself one." He looked at her. "You could have told me that 3 years ago." "You needed to figure it out yourself," she said. "That's how it works." He thought about that. "That's annoying," he said. "Most true things are," she said. He stayed on as head cook at Dalton's Table, which was not how either of them would have predicted his life going when he was a 17-year-old with a broken leg and a ranch hand's job. But that was the thing about paths. They didn't always go where you aimed them, and sometimes the deviation was the point. Iron Creek Ranch itself grew steadily. Not dramatically. Silas was not a man who sought dramatic growth. He was a man who built things that lasted, which was a different ambition and in many ways a harder one. They hired well, and they paid fairly, and they maintained the kind of operation where people stayed because they wanted to, not because they couldn't do better elsewhere. Crow worked another 4 years before his knees finally said enough, and he retired to a small place in Granton, and Maeve drove out to see him every month and brought food every time, because that was the language they had. Forsyth, the hand who'd stayed despite the pressure, who'd said it plainly and made his choice, became the ranch foreman eventually, which was the right job for a man who demonstrated he made decisions based on what was right rather than what was easy. Teller, the quiet man who'd come on in the difficult autumn, turned out to be the best cattle handler on the property, and also, unexpectedly, a person who could fix almost anything mechanical, which made him essentially irreplaceable, and which he was too modest to realize or at least to say. The kitchen garden expanded twice more and eventually produced more than the ranch house needed, and the surplus went to the restaurant, which created a loop that Maeve found satisfying in a way she didn't always have words for. The ground the land was feeding, the food the kitchen was making, the people the food was sustaining, all of it turning in on itself like something that had found its own right shape. On a morning in the fall, 8 years after she'd walked 5 miles through the afternoon heat and arrived at Iron Creek with 43 cents and her mother's journal, Maeve stood in the kitchen of Dalton's Table before the lunch service and watched Clara teach a girl who'd come in looking for work the way Ida had once come, the way Maeve had once come. That specific combination of nerve and need that she recognized as intimately as her own handwriting. Clara was patient with the girl in a way that told Maeve that what she'd tried to give Clara had traveled forward, had become part of how Clara understood the work and the people doing it. She showed the girl how to hold the knife correctly, not sharply, not impatiently, just matter-of-factly, the way you show someone something that it's only useful to know if you show them properly. Maeve watched from the doorway and didn't interrupt. She thought about her mother, as she often did in kitchens, in the way that grief softens over time from a sharp thing to a presence, to something you carry alongside you rather than inside you. She thought about the journal, which lived in the drawer of the nightstand at the ranch, and which she still read sometimes, not for the recipes mostly, but for the notes in the margins, for the cramped handwriting that said things like, "A full pot is easier than a half pot, and you have to want to feed someone." She thought about what she'd said to Clara's mother, that the story wasn't inspiring, that it was mostly stubbornness. She still believed that. She didn't think she'd been extraordinary. She thought she'd been ordinary in the specific way that means refusing to stop. Not because you're certain you'll win, but because stopping feels worse than whatever comes next. There was no genius in that. It was just a decision you made and then kept making every morning when you got up and built the fire and started the coffee and began again. She thought about the things she'd gotten wrong, the times she'd moved on when she might have stayed and fought, the people she'd kept at arm's length because letting them close felt like a risk she didn't know how to calculate, the months of her life spent in the familiar protection of expecting rejection because it was easier to expect it than to be surprised by it. She'd been wrong about that. Not always, not entirely, but enough that she could look back and see the shape of it clearly now. She thought about Silas, who was at the ranch right now doing whatever Silas was doing on a Tuesday morning, which was probably something methodical and necessary and unglamorous, because that was the kind of man he was. And that was one of the things she loved most about him. The girl in the kitchen said something she couldn't hear, and Clara laughed, short and real, and the sound of it came out through the kitchen door and into the morning like something that had been let free. Maeve pushed off the doorframe and went inside. "Room for another pair of hands?" she said. Clara looked up. "Always." She put on her apron and went to the work table and picked up a knife, and the prep work started, and the kitchen filled with its sounds and smells, and the particular quality of attention that a room full of people making food develops when everyone in it knows what they're doing. Outside, Blackridge was going about its Tuesday. 8 years had changed it. Not completely. Not in every corner, because towns didn't change the way people changed. They changed slower and with more resistance. But the hail-shaped hole in its center had filled with something different, something that was still being decided. New businesses. Different voices on the council. A cattle fair that now drew buyers from 4 counties, partly because Iron Creek's reputation had become part of the territory's reputation, which was not something Maeve had planned and was not something she felt entirely comfortable taking credit for, but was true regardless. Ruth Crandall still came for coffee on Thursdays, which had become a fixed point in Maeve's week, a conversation that ranged over everything and settled nothing and was one of the better things in her life. The woman from the competition, the one who'd given her time, had become, without either of them quite deciding to, a friend. That was something Maeve hadn't expected. Not the friends specifically, but the accumulation of them, the way people had gathered around her life and stayed, which had not been the pattern before. She thought it was probably because she had a place now, a fixed point, a kitchen, a set of coordinates that people could find her at, and that having a place made it possible for people to stay in a way that being always in motion had prevented. She thought about that sometimes, about how much of her loneliness had been circumstance and how much had been armor she'd put on so gradually she'd stopped noticing the weight of it. She thought the honest answer was probably both. The lunch service filled and emptied, and the afternoon came on cool and golden, the way fall afternoons in this part of the territory did, the light coming at an angle that made everything look considered. Maeve was at the back of the kitchen doing the accounts when Decker put his head through the door and said, "There's a woman out front asking for you, young. Says she heard about this place from someone in Granton. Says she's looking for work and she can cook." Maeve set down her pencil. "Did you taste anything she made?" "Not yet." "Ask her to make something, whatever she wants, with whatever we have available." She picked up the pencil again. "Then come tell me what you think." Decker looked at her. "You're not going to come out?" "Not yet." She looked at the accounts. "I want your read first." He was quiet for a moment, and she could tell he understood what she was doing, that she was giving him the assessment, giving him that authority, the same way Silas had given her 3 days and a work table and the space to show what she was. "Okay," he said, "give me 20 minutes." He went. She went back to the accounts. The kitchen sound settled around her, the comfortable noise of a place that knew what it was and did it well. And outside the windows, the afternoon light moved on the street of a town that had once turned her away from every door, and that she had, in the end, decided to stay and change rather than leave and forget. She had not forgotten that it hadn't been a clean victory, that people had been hurt in the doing of it, that she had been hurt, that the town still had its shadows and its unresolved things. She had not forgotten that courage looked a lot like stubbornness from the inside, and that most of the things she was proud of had come out of moments when she was too tired and too angry to make the easier choice of leaving. She had not forgotten her mother, or the journal, or the 43 cents, or the 5 miles. She didn't think she would. She thought those were the kinds of things that stayed with you, not because they were the worst things that had happened, but because they were the hinge point, the place where the story turned on itself and became something different than it had been. Decker came back in 15 minutes, which was faster than 20. He stood in the doorway with the expression she'd come to know as his serious one, not his pleased one, not his polite one, but the one that meant he'd actually thought about something. "Well?" she said. "She made corn porridge," he said, "with dried apple." Maeve looked up from the accounts. "It was better than fine," he said. Precisely. Deliberately. The exact words she'd said to him 8 years ago in a different kitchen when he'd asked her about the difference. She looked at him for a moment, and he looked back, and the thing that passed between them didn't need to be said out loud because they both already knew what it was. She put down her pencil and stood up. "Tell her she's got 3 days," she said, and went out front to meet whoever came next.